Imagine, if you will, that the history of Earth is plotted along a line that runs from the planetarium just outside of Dallas, Texas, all the way right to where I'm standing at the pulpit here at All Souls. We're talking about 3 to 4 billion years set across a distance of about 250 miles, or about 250 years per inch. And I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Forrest Church, who originally came up with this idea and wrote about it in his book, Lifecraft, that I mentioned earlier, where he plotted the Earth's history from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to his pulpit at All Souls in Manhattan in the Upper West Side of New York City. Now, of course, he had some more interesting plot points, like Harvard University, Yankee Stadium, the Statue of Liberty. But we have our own points of interest between here and Dallas. We've got downtown Okmulgee, right? Turkey Mountain, the Prayer Tower at Oral Roberts University. So, not to be outdone. So if we imagine on this physical continuum, you begin on the front steps of the planetarium there in Mesquite, Texas, just outside of Dallas, with the Paramecium, the first primeval protoplasm. Then you need to walk really fast, or maybe even hitchhike in a car, because you're going to have to skip past Fort Worth, through Plano, cruise across the Red River, and past Lake Texoma. You keep going past the prison in McAlester, Oklahoma, the Love's Rest Stop in Durant, Oklahoma, and the Choctaw Casino. You just keep going through Henrietta, all the way past Jenks, Oklahoma. And it's not until you arrive at Oral Roberts University here in Tulsa that you would find the first amphibians emerging out of the water somewhere between the left forearm and the right forearm of the praying hands. I've done the math. And then not until you make your way from there, heading this way to the Lubies on 71st Street, would the first birds and mammals emerge. And these furry and flying creatures would, for a time, share the earth with the dinosaurs, which would come on the scene about 65th and Peoria, and would die off before we reach 61st. Monkeys would not even show up until we get to the Brahms on 51st Street. And even by the time you reach the front door of this church, and I mean the front door right here, closest to Peoria, the most sophisticated creature that you will happen upon is the chimpanzee. And then as you enter the door of the sanctuary, right over there, you'd be greeted by a Neanderthal. No offense to the current ushers. And then you'll have to walk all the way down the aisle here into the first pew where David is sitting before you see the first Homo sapien emerge. And approximately 14,000 years of recorded history, as we know it, begins as you step onto the chancel right here, just 2 strides away from the present moment. It's not until you arrive 2 inches from the tip of my shoe that Europeans discover America. 1 inch away is the Declaration of Independence. 1/2 inch away is Darwin's theory of evolution. And 1/3 of an inch away, we see the invention of the airplane. And it was on this tiny piece of dust that I can see that is on my shoe, but we know from science it's not really touching my shoe. It is in that microcosmic gap between particle and shoe when Al Gore invented the internet, or whoever invented the internet, and the Hubble telescope began to send us pictures of the outer reaches of our galaxy. Think of all that has happened just in the last 2 inches of this journey. That 2 inches includes Copernicus discovering, quite controversially, that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and of course Europeans discovering the Americas. It's nothing short of amazing that in the millions of steps that it would take to walk from Dallas to here, the entire sweep of human history is contained in only the last 2 steps. All technology, theology, philosophy, music, science, literature, all of it is contained in the last 2 strides in this walk of time. And yet, that said, most religions are based on the idea that the universe begins and ends for the sole purpose of human life. And much of Christianity that we find here in the Bible Belt teaches that the penultimate event of all history happened about 8 inches ago upon the birth and death of Jesus Christ. And there's a belief that among many that it was just 8 inches later that the world will end. Anytime now. In other words, billions of people worldwide are completely fixated on the last 8 inches of this journey in their religious thinking and in their understanding of life itself. While the religion and the cosmology of all souls spans the entire 200 plus miles, and even further, because we would go into the planetarium and we would learn about the stars and recognize that it all really began billions and billions and billions of years before Earth ever existed. The contrast in our theologies and our cosmologies could not be any bigger than it is with the majority of people in Oklahoma, in Texas, and around the world. Now, if you're visiting today, and I know a lot of people visit at the end of the summer looking for a church to attend, if you're looking for a community of values for yourself, maybe for your children, that takes into account the entire and amazing story of time, then you are in the right place this morning. But before we get too self-congratulatory, let's be clear that this does not mean that we, who have a more expansive and scientific worldview, are any less ignorant about what this all means, any less ignorant about how this all came about than the people whose ignorance is contained in those 8-inch blinders. Like Socrates, who in his time boasted of being the most ignorant man in Athens, was by far the most knowledgeable person, yet because he knew so much, he recognized how little he actually knew. In other words, or in the words of Forest Church, we on this planet are much more alike in our ignorance than we are different in what we think we know. And that brings me to my subject for this morning, which is humility. The title of my sermon is Facing Change. And one of the keys to facing change well is humility. As much as people seem to dislike change, we live in a world where the only thing that is constant is the fact that there is always and everything changes. What a cruel joke then to be alive in a world of perpetual change and yet have a temperament that deeply desires stability. And one thing that is undisputable from this history of time that I've been presenting is that the pace of change keeps speeding up. When you think of all that has happened in those last 2 steps, in those last 8 inches, in the last half an inch since Darwin's theory of evolution, and the third of an inch since the airplane was first invented. Change continues and it's speeding up. Look around how America is changing, how the Middle East is changing, how religion in general should be changing, and in some ways is. Science and technology are constantly changing. I read stuff in the paper. I don't even know anymore whether I'm supposed to eat a high fiber, low fat diet or a low carb, high fat, low carb. It changes every year. I can't even figure out what to eat anymore. I'm just eating everything now. So I'm changing in some different ways, including growing a little bigger. But we all face all kinds of changes in the course of our lives. The loss of our certain physical capacities and attributes, loss of loved ones, our jobs change, our children grow up, our relationships bend and break and disintegrate, and people give up on them. And so a key part of the human condition is figuring out how to be alive, knowing that we will die, and finding ways to face change without being defeated by it. A writer who I enjoy reading, Bo Lazoff, says that when we are facing change, our choice is often between humility or defeat. In his book, It's a Meaningful Life, he tells a story about when he was 18 and he fell asleep while driving on a lonely stretch of highway in his little compact car, and had a head-on, high-speed collision with a tractor-trailer. He fractured his skull, he crushed a disc in his spine, he burst his spleen, and he took most of the glass from the windshield into his face. He says that he pulled glass shards out of his face for 2 years as they made their way to the surface of his skin. His life was brought to a sudden stop. He realized that this kind of setback in life will either defeat you or humble you. And he discovered that the difference between defeat and humility in times of change is one of the greatest lessons in life. Being humbled meant allowing the shock, the pain, the years of recuperation open him up rather than shut him down. It made him more compassionate and more understanding rather than more bitter and angry. Being defeated would have involved shutting people out, wallowing in self-pity, and becoming more demanding and angry. And we've all met people who have done that. Many of us have done that ourselves. You may be doing it right now. So I'm sure you know from your own life experience how easy it is to shut down and turn our lives over to fear and turn our hurt into anger when we face difficult changes in our lives. He says for some reason, lying in that hospital bed with tubes running out of every orifice, he gradually softened into humility rather than hardening into anger. As I read his story, I was reminded of some advice that I was given at a time of deep loss and change in my own life. I was told to take up something totally new, something that I had no experience with, something that would not be easy or intuitive for me. I chose to start learning African drumming. At first, I couldn't even keep a beat if my life depended on it. It seemed hopeless. I felt like a fool. I felt like a klutz, like I couldn't even figure out how to move my arms properly. And I realized I had not felt like that for a long time. Why? Because at a certain point in my life, I started choosing to do things only that I was good at, that I had mastered or that I knew I could pick up quickly. And if I didn't or couldn't, I dropped it really fast. For example, back when I was in graduate school, I started a martial arts class. I thought that would be really something special to be a martial artist. I ended up marrying a martial artist. But it was very hard for me. Being a beginner, everything felt awkward. I felt uncoordinated, and I could see how much I had to learn. I mean, the time it was going to take, the practice. I watched the people who'd been doing it for years. They were smooth and knowledgeable and amazing, really. And I had such a far way to go, I felt small. I was the low man on the totem pole. And being the rookie, being the beginner, there were guys half my age who were so far advanced from me. Some of the people had very little life experience, very little formal education, and some of them seemed to me to be in completely dead-end jobs. Now, I'm not proud of this, but if I'm going to be honest this morning, at that point in my life, some of these were people who in other arenas I would have looked down on or felt superior to. I was a graduate student at Harvard, and some of these guys were pumping gas at gas stations. But in the dojo, where you practice martial arts, they were my teachers, my superiors. They could and probably did get some good laughs at my expense. My ego at the time could not take it. I was just starting to feel like I was reaching a level of dignity and sophistication and success. I was just starting to get a sense of myself as someone who could play some contributing role to society and to community, and my sense of identity was so fragile that putting myself in a situation in which I was the runt of the litter, the ball boy, the gopher, the one who was the butt of other people's jokes, I just couldn't handle it. At that time, I needed to lean into ways where I was capable and skilled to prove something to myself. So it began. In my mid-20s, I started only doing things that I was good at, and I stopped putting myself in situations where I was the bumbling beginner, awkward and unsure. And I've come to see that that is not unusual for people to find their groove, so to speak, to stay in their lane where they know the rules and know how to succeed. But there's something about being a beginner that is both humbling and instructive. For me, taking up drumming at that time of grief and immense change in my life reminded me that I'm human, reminded me of being a kid again, in a sense reminded me of who I am. The roots of the word human are also the same roots of the words humility, humor, humane, humanitarian, humus, the decomposed plant and animal matter that makes up the soil. Ultimately, we are all eventually going to become the food and home for terrestrial worms. We are humus in the making. From stardust we have come, and to dust we shall return. It is good to remember this, so that we can keep our sense of humor and take ourselves lightly. And some people get confused between humility and humiliation, and they couldn't be further apart. Humiliation, of course, is caused by judgment of one who thinks they're superior to someone else and thinks they're smarter and morally superior and can put someone else down. Sometimes we do it to ourselves based on standards that we've picked up, and we judge ourselves against those standards and find ourselves lacking. The problem with humiliation is that it destroys people's self-respect, their self-esteem. It creates fear and insecurity. It quashes people's hopes. Whereas humility says, I have a lot still to learn. I must be open to getting help sometimes. I must be open to realizing that I may not know what I need right now. And in doing so, humility allows us to live beyond our own limitations, because we realize that we do not have to depend on our own resources alone. Humility allows us to be able to laugh at ourselves because we know that we are as funny and fallible as everyone else, and that's okay. It allows us to be learners. It encourages us to let go of things that are out of our control anyway. And therefore, humility empowers hope. It engenders trust. Humility is free of contempt. Humility is patient and kind. That's why one of the keys to navigating change, one of the keys to a successful life, to successful relationships, is humility. We are neither the center of the universe nor the purpose of all creation. Yet we are alive, and the innovations of the human mind are nothing short of miraculous. But in the spirit of human kinship and with hope for the human race, let us remember that we are more alike with our fellow travelers in our ignorance than we are different in our knowledge. And therefore, let us walk humbly as we strive to live a truly meaningful life. Thank you.